Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Derek.
Hello.
So I like to start each episode by asking you guys what you've been listening to lately, but in lieu of my pick, I want to ask our listeners to please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. I noticed the other day that we got a bad rating, screwed up our average, probably from some mad Billie Eilish fan, even though Darren said he likes Billie Eilish more than Neutral Milk Hotel, which I think is a lot. Yeah, but you just can't please these people. So please, if you like this podcast at all, leave us a 5-star rating. Why not? Dan, I think you said you went on a field trip this past week.
Yeah, I saw Boris live in Tampa at a place called the Orpheum. I've seen them a handful of times before. They're always they're just one of the best live bands. It was pretty cool. They played, they opened with some cover of, I've never heard of. And then they played some songs from their new record that comes out next month. And they were cool. They played a lot of rockers. Boris has some rockin' songs, some drone, whatever, they're all over the place.
Yep.
Which, I'm more of the drone fan. But then they played all of Feedbacker, which is their best album and, just solidly drone. So that was really awesome to see live. Great show.
Didn't we saw them together years ago, and there was some other band in town at the same time, and so it was pretty empty. Was this a packed show?
No, not really. No, not really at all. The venue, it's a medium-sized venue, probably holds a few hundred people, but there was probably maybe 100 people. It's so much that there was some really neckbeardy kind of people at this show, and one guy kept he was determined to fucking crowd surf, but there wasn't enough people or densely packed enough to do so, and so he kept he kept trying to do it, and this one guy who was bigger, he saw him, so he just picked him up and sort of walked him around the room, which I felt was nice.
Ballet.
Yeah, it was nice, so got what he was trying to do, I guess.
Interesting fans of Boris, which I guess you are among.
Yeah,
Derek,
exactly.
What have you been listening to lately?
Aside from what we're talking about today, I came back to Vampire Weekend's Father of the Bride, and I'm mentioning it again because we really should do an episode on Vampire Weekend at some point.
I'm down because I tried to listen to it and just couldn't get through it, and I would kind of like to be able to force myself to do it, but I don't know if Dan's going to go for it. We'll have to talk about that off air. Kind of a similar situation, honestly, with the album we're going to talk about today, which I guess we can jump into now. A couple of weeks ago, we received a very kind email from a fellow Floridian, actually, named Paul, who suggested that we discuss one of his favorite albums, Burial's Untrue, from 2007. And he actually made a really good case for why it might complement some of our recent conversations about the musical landscape of the last decade. On one hand, we decided to take Paul's suggestion because we want to encourage you all to write to us with suggestions of your own. Honestly, it's kind of a bitch coming up with a new topic every 2 weeks, so we would really appreciate it. But at the same time, we were really excited to talk about this record in particular because it's one of those mega classics that all three of us have somehow failed to get into. And it turns out we ought to be pretty embarrassed about that because, as Paul mentioned, pretty much every 10-year retrospective that came out back in 2017 declared Untrue one of the most important and influential albums in recent memory. So I think the first step to fixing this blunder is fessing up. What is your previous familiarity with Burial and Untrue specifically, and how did you manage to kind of miss it back in 2007?
Yeah, with me, I'm a big fan of electronic music, so I've run through, all the big names, and I've definitely listened to this album before, but it's always an album that I listen to a time or two, and then I just kind of forget about it or move on. I've never really sat down and digested it as much as I have in these past 2 weeks for this episode. Uh-huh. So I don't know. I don't remember when the first time I listened to it was, but whenever I was into electronic music, that's when I first started listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, I've always sort of dabbled in electronic music. I'm obviously not as into it as either of you two, but I have still heard of Burial, but have not listened to this album until recently.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I definitely listened to it when it first came out, and it was getting so much hype. And it just, for some reason, I really liked that, second song, the first real song, Archangel. thought it was very catchy, but the album just was not what I was really looking for some reason. It just didn't really click with me. And then over the years, I've seen it, I want to talk about this later, but it became one of those like mulecore type albums, for lack of a better term, that just gets like posted online and just has this obsessive following, getting memed constantly. And so it just felt like, something I've got to get around to eventually, but then it sort of felt like I had missed my chance. So I was actually really glad that we decided to do this. Now, on that note, I wanted to kind of ask, like, what was the state of music as you remember it back in 2007 when this came out? I'm trying to get at, like, was there anything like this going on at the time? And I know this is kind of a vague, weird question, but a while ago, we did an episode counting down our favorite albums of 2009. And we talked a lot about how 2009 was kind of the end of one era and sort of the start of the next era. So that era, how would you describe that era of music? And do you see Burial as like a standout or kind of fitting in to 2007?
I guess I guess Burial sort of is a little bit of a standout. Like I think it's somewhat different. I'm trying to, off the top of my head, think of like what other records came out in 2000. When like somebody asks you, I can count down a couple. I got the Rate Your Music rating right here. So Radiohead's In Rainbows is the number one album of that year. LCD Sound System, Sound of Silver. Animal Collective, Strawberry Jam. We got Arcade Fire's Neon Bible. Panda Bear's Person Pitch. There's that Bon Iver album, For Emma Forever Go, that everybody seems to like, but I hate. By the way, I was listening to his new album recently, and I can't believe how much it sucks. Oh, I know. Yeah.
I just wanted to get that out there.
It does.
I don't get it. Of Montreal, Hissing Fauna, Kanye West Graduation. I think what I'm trying to get at is this was like the biggest, brightest, funnest indie explosion. Doesn't it kind of feel that way?
Yeah, it's like when anything in that list is like sort of electronic themed, Animal Collective, Panda Bear a little bit, of Montreal to an extent. It's not like this sort of electronic music. Like you said, it's bright. Even like Hissing Fauna, which is like a dark record. It's like a dark record through the like this cheery, happy lens. Whereas like that is not what Burial is at all.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Burial might have a little more in line with like Radiohead's In Rainbows.
I could see that a little bit.
I mean, I don't think that it's a stretch to say that this kind of fits in with that record, at least,
Because honestly, I always think of In Rainbows as being like the weirdly happiest Radiohead album, which is like really strange
with like
for
House
them.
of Cards on it.
Yeah, that song is like nice. That song is like really pleasant. You could play that like in a spa or something. It's like such a warm, colorful, and I'm not just saying that because of the album cover, but like it's like a vibrant album from a pretty dour band. And I've always felt like that kind of sums up the era. Like even Radiohead was in a good mood in 2007, other stuff as I'm continuing to scroll through this list. You remember MIA's Kala, the song like Paper Planes blew up. Yeah. And do you guys remember Justice, their Cross album?
Yeah. I liked that record. Their second record was fucking awful.
Yeah. But I mean, basically a Daft Punk ripoff, but just think about the contrast between Justice and like Paper Planes and, Burial, where it's almost like the way that electronic music is being used in this period is almost like a novelty, it's for like fun. Indie is kind of making its way into clubs and stuff. People are like dancing to it, which you couldn't really do that much before. It just feels like Burial is so dark and gloomy in a period that was the total opposite of that. It sounds like you guys don't totally agree, though.
I mean, I agree partially with you, but I don't really agree with your assessment of In Rainbows. But we could have that argument a different day. But
okay.
But yeah, no, I do. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's definitely like brighter, happier, like overall that year. And this is definitely not any of that. But something about it, its sound for me still kind of like feels like that period in some way. Maybe not 2007, but kind of around it. You know what I mean? Like pre-2010.
Can you put your finger on that at all?
I can't. It just... Well, I mean, because like I guess we talk about this a lot. Like, does an album feel dated or sound dated?
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily saying this sounds dated in a negative way, but I I don't think that this sounds like 2019. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's certain records that you can tell when they're made, and it's not often it is a bad thing, but it's not always. Yeah, I get what you mean there. I agree with you, Gabe. I don't think that this record fits in. Like I said, the only sort of like dark things in that list are through a cheery lens and whatnot. So I agree with you.
Yeah, to me, it just feels like so different from anything else in that period. It doesn't sound like 2007 at all to me. In fact, I was, when we got this email, I think I was just like trying to think of like different topics we could do. Like, could we compare and contrast it with something? And I was thinking of like, what other albums came out that year? What was it, like 2011, 2012? And like, I was just gobsmacked to realize it came out in 2007, But again, it was kind of like the first time I had ever heard anything like this. I do want to acknowledge his first self-titled album, so nobody like ats us about this. It came out in 2006, the year before, and it's got a very similar vibe. But Untrue, I think, was really the breakthrough. This was when Pitchfork like barely acknowledged the first one, and then they declared Untrue basically a masterpiece, and everybody had to listen to it. And it was described, Untrue at the time, as basically like a revolutionary new sound. So let's try to describe the sound of Untrue. How would you guys describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that like is immediately apparent about it is like these vocals that are all over it, which vocals often not a big thing in this sort of electronic music, but they're either like pitch shifted up or down, slowed, sped up, often like through some sort of like a band pass filter, like a low pass filter or something, where giving them like a sort of like a eerie, distant kind of feel over these like break beats that are and we'll talk about why a little bit coming up, but like they've got the swing to them, and not like the 1930s slang swing, like the musical term swing, where everything's not exactly on time, which again is also sort of an odd thing in electronic music. Drum machines tend to sort of dehumanize the drums and everything, whereas here, like we're getting electronic sounds with sort of a human feel to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think of like like an atmosphere type of feel, right? When I think about electronic music, obviously you have like your real danceable electronic music. This is not really that, there's a lot, as much as like there are like those like break beats like Dan mentioned, and like the percussion and stuff. There's also just a lot less. There's like none of that at times, you know what I mean? And you're just sort of like feeling like you're drifting. Wow. Yeah. It's exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that honestly, this was I have distinct memory of feeling this way back when I first put this on in 2007, which is that, which is what I was trying to get at, is that it just didn't really bang like I wanted it to, and in 2007, just the state of indie and electronica, what I was looking for was something that like banged, like that Justice song, that was such a big hit. Something like Paper Planes or whatever. I mean, that was like when all the indie kids were getting into electronic music and sort of, MGMT's coming out and all this stuff. And, it's fun and upbeat. And this was just, it was so catchy, especially that Archangel song, but it just is like, moody and ambient and drifting. And, I guess to describe more of the sound, yeah, I think what jumps out at me, a lot of people mention the vocals, and we'll definitely want to talk more about that. But the beats, like you were saying, Dan, are just so strange. They're like kind of clattering high noises, and they're like, it just feels like they consist of sounds like, keys jangling or, stuff like that. Like sometimes like hitting a Pringles can or, lightly or something like that. And then another thing that's so strange to me is like there's like a constant sound of like vinyl crackle or some kind of like lo-fi thing separating you from the music. Sometimes it sounds like rain, sometimes it sounds like vinyl record. And the like synth tones are so washed in reverb and so like thick and, luxurious but kind of foggy sounding. Sometimes I think the bass sounds like a subway train passing by, it's just like and to me that is just the strangest sound. I mean, what do you guys, do you guys like these beats? Did they take some getting used to?
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into it yet, I guess, but like I like the beats a lot. I think my complaint is that they don't change much throughout the record. Like we kind of are. I feel like we're working with one palette here. Very like obviously like often the drums like sort of sound exactly the same. Not the same beat, but the same like kit from song to song, and it wears a little thin sometimes on me.
Yeah, what do you think, Darren?
I mean, I kind of found that a bit unifying, but we can sort of talk about that. Yeah, I mean, I think, actually, what was your original question? Dan kind of threw me off.
The beats. What do you like these beats? I think they're odd because, like I'm saying, they don't really like bang. They're like it's like strange clattering over the top of like just subterranean bass tones and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you mentioned like, did it take some getting used to? Yes. Yeah, it definitely did. Because they would just kind of come and go. Maybe the first time I heard it, I was like, okay, all right, here we go. We're gonna bang here. Here it comes. And then it sort of just drifts away, and then it comes back later on. And I never really got used to it. It was kind of hard to like predict when it was about to like kind of pick up, you know what I mean? But I didn't really feel like it was ever, boring or anything. I kind of grew to like it. Like I felt like it sort of helped define the sound in a lot of ways,
Yeah, to me, I mean, this is one of the most fascinating parts of the album. And Dan, you sort of alluded to this, but we might as well get into it. So he basically makes all of his beats, or all of his tracks really, using this pretty primitive program called SoundForge, where it's just, I could totally relate to this because I was doing this like long after, proper DAWs came out and everything, where it's just like, you're basically just sliding around little soundwave files and not lining them up properly with a sequencer and everything. So he's kind of like doing it by hand, and it creates beats that are kind of like slipping in and out of time a little bit. They're not like sequenced just right. They're not lined up just right, quantized or anything. He also talks about like wanting his beats to sort of look a certain way in like a visual sense on this like just map of soundwave files, and it creates a really strange, it's weird because Dan, I think I kind of agree with you that the beats there's something similar about them, and yet because they're never quite locked in, the tracks feel really alive. Like the beat is just sort of changing and evolving the whole time.
No, I agree, and I mean, I think one of the best things about this record is the swing, and that the drums aren't quantized or lined up perfect and everything like that. That is definitely like one of the best things about this record. I think it's just it's more of like the palette of drum sounds used. Just sort of were always the same drum sounds is what I was getting at. Yeah,
and so with these very skeletal, I think, beats, and these kind of like droning synths, there are a couple other things I think we got to spend more time on. The vocals in particular, what do you guys make of the kind of, pitch shifted, corrected, changed vocals? You often, they sound like sort of disembodied voices. There's often, as with almost everything on this record, tons of reverb and echo, and it just sounds like these voices are like distant memories or ghosts or something like that. What did you guys make of that aspect of the album?
Well, I like it. Like Archangel is a great song. I love the vocals on that. That in and of itself, great. Again, just every sort of song, or almost every song, we're getting it's almost like there's a checklist. The drums are gonna be like this, and then we'll have like a weird disembodied vocal that's either fast or slow. Like I just felt like it would have hit a little better if it wasn't as constant as it is.
What do you think, Darren?
Again, I kind of had a hard time with it at first, largely because I had no context, right? I just kind of came to this record, put it on, didn't really know what I was hearing, right? Come to find out, kind of where these samples are being pulled from, it really changed my listening of the record, right? Caused me to pay attention a little bit more, kind of listen to how he was manipulating all of these different vocals, and that became something that I was really kind of intrigued by, just the way he was using it. The way you sort of mentioned like ghosts or voices, like to me, they sound like memories or just like thoughts inside of somebody's head. You know how you kind of like, you know, things kind of flash into your head, a memory from the past, and it's only like a fragment of it or something. Like that's kind of what those sort of became, because I knew a little bit more about where they originated from. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we got to dive into that and spend a while on it. The sample sources are so bizarre. I don't know if it would occur to you. In fact, I really don't think it would unless you sort of started to read into it. But they basically come from like the shittiest music ever. And I want to emphasize that this is pre-Poptimism. So this is especially odd to choose to sample stuff like Beyonce, pre-woke Beyonce, I should clarify, Ray J, Christina Aguilera, like Ashanti, Usher, just like the most like garbage radio R&B, but it'll just be, short little snippets of just like not the main melody even, but just some little melody and like looped and chopped up in different ways. I mean, what do you make of, like, what is he trying to do sampling from such sources?
Yeah, it is like a really odd, choice. Because like another person who like was famous for doing vocals like this, like the RZA, he did it with R&B, but it was like, kind of better R&B, like 70s,
classic,
classic kind of stuff. Like you said, this is like sort of the actual dark ages of R&B, early 2000s. It's like the shittiest like radio stations. This is what they're playing. So it is like a really odd choice, and I do appreciate that, like, because if he was sampling just classic stuff, you'd be like, oh, he's a fan of the RZA or something, it like would be a little like not as innovative. Or if he was sampling indie hits or whatever, it's just like using something that like I feel like the person listening to this record, more likely than not, you're probably not going to also have listened to these like shitty R&B songs, so you're probably not going to recognize them, so they feel sort of, it makes them feel like more alien or like ghostly in that you don't like know them,
Yeah, but maybe they sound like occasionally like vaguely familiar in some weird way.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of like the Beyonce one, like sort of like, I thought like, is that Beyonce?
I remember that Ray J song.
I didn't remember any of the like actual songs.
I remember the Ray J song. I remember there's like an Aaliyah song. I remember Christina Aguilera's "You Are Beautiful," whatever.
I do know that
I remember
song,
some of this shit, but you wouldn't like be able to place it listening, but maybe it just sounds vaguely familiar, and that's maybe there's I'm trying to get it, like, is there some thematic reason, Darren, that you see like with this kind of like thing you kind of remember but can't place,
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because take, for example, the title track, which samples the Beyonce song, right? I mean, like you mentioned, I don't think anybody is going to recognize this as being a Beyonce song when he pitches it so low that it sounds like a man just...
It really does. It sounds nothing like Beyonce.
But then you listen to the lyrics and you think about what the word untrue means, and he samples this line about like, because you lied, like over and over again. And suddenly it just takes on a whole new like meaning, I feel like. And I think it's like really, really interesting that he's pulling this out of a Beyonce song and just transforming it. You know what I mean?
I know. I think there's something so fascinating about that, because it's like a commentary on the song itself, or like on this form of music, which I don't even know how to get into it, but it's like there's something strange about sort of like listening to music like that, ironically. And I think a lot of this music, it kind of evokes the feeling of like walking home from a club or something like that. Sad that you struck out or weren't brave enough to get on the dance floor, or, just didn't fit in or whatever. And, so you're walking home with your hoodie on, it's like raining a little, and whatever, you're waiting for the bus, you're really lonely, and you know, it just is like these shitty songs that would have been playing at the club are like echoing in your head,
Right.
and it somehow adds to like the tragedy of it all. I mean, do you get at all what I'm trying to say?
Well, it's like no one else in the club is listening to the song except for you.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? Like you happen to be the one that picks up on like the meaning, or you take it beyond whatever like Beyonce's audience is getting. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
or you connect it to your own life, you know, like because
Right.
Beyonce, you know, is singing about like whatever, you know, who gives a shit. But maybe when she just said that line, like because you lied, it just kind of like made you think about your own something you're going through,
Right.
and so that line just like keeps repeating in your head or something. You know, there's something very introspective and like very fascinating about the way that samples are used here. Are you on board with any of this, Dan?
No, yeah, I agree with you, and I like this is a great record to like intellectualize and talk about like the process of.
I'm
like,
going to do a lot of that tonight.
Yeah, and honestly, that's my favorite part about this record. Like, I wish I enjoyed listening to the record as much as I enjoy thinking about and talking about the record.
That's interesting. We should return to that because, yeah, I think that I became very fascinated with thinking about this record, and I want to do a lot of that. And it's probably the kind of thing where I'm like, you start to ruin the record if you think about it too much. But, you know, I was kind of in awe, like in even a non-intellectual way, at, you know, the way a song that, you know, is just repeating the word like closer. I think that's Shell of Light. You know, just closer. It's like, it's just devastating somehow. Just this word, the word closer, repeated over and over again. I found it very moving. Did you have a similar experience, Darren?
Yeah, and again, it kind of came in a bit later on, because I do feel like, and I feel like it's important that we sort of discuss this, like the album, for as sparse as it seems in places, like it's a dense record. You know what I mean? Like
yes.
I feel like you're just not going to get it. And I'm sure plenty of people who call this like their favorite record and say things like, you know, this got me through so much and stuff, like they would agree, like you're just not going to get it like on the first couple of listens.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
this is one of those records that requires, you know, it's like, you know, a novel where additional readings are kind of necessary, and like reading essays or something just to kind of fully understand, to try to grasp, you know, the record itself. Like just simply listening to it's not good enough. So early on, I mean, I admit I wasn't really into it, but it just kind of it shifted as the more I dug in, you know.
We can come back to this maybe, you know, after we've given our opinions a little more, but like, is a record that you have to like know more about than just listen to? Is that a good record? You know, like,
see, I kind of feel like, you know, for me, there was like this first level experience, which was great, but then it was that much deeper when I started to sort of read into it, because, you know, this first level, like I said, there's just this idea of repeating the word, this like disembodied, like haunting voice is just saying the word closer over and over again. And so I'm thinking about like, the music makes me feel profoundly lonely somehow. It's like very isolating music. And I think without reading anything, I mean, maybe the cover sort of adds to this, but you feel like just you're, you know, in a hoodie in the rain by yourself, completely on like a desolate, empty street or whatever at night. And, you know, this idea of like closer, like I just think of like wanting to be closer to somebody, to anybody or something. And so that like just works. But then when I read that it comes from, you know, some shitty, stupid song, it just makes it like that much more interesting, but that much sadder too, because it's like, it's hollow, you know. It's like it's a meaningless, shitty song that is kind of resonating with me. I guess I'm having trouble articulating it, but
it's like
I really think it works on these
right?
two
Because
levels.
like he could have just somehow sang or said the word closer and just manipulated it and used it, and you know what I mean. Like
like it didn't have to come from something,
right? But knowing that it did adds something to the song. I agree with you. Yeah,
I think it does, but I really feel like it can work on both levels. But it approaches like this sort of classic masterpiece level when you start to read into it, and that's just sort of the case. I mean, like, would DJ Shadow's Introducing be a great record if you didn't know it it consisted entirely of samples?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a good question. I'm not saying I don't dislike this record or anything. I just wonder. I was thinking about that a lot this week. Like you just said, it doesn't just apply to this record. DJ Shadow, that's a good example. Avalanches, stuff like that. I mean, even other forms of art. Like you can't just read Paradise Lost without like knowing all the shit about it. But does that like make it I don't know, it's just like it's a weird thing to like need, especially with like music, to like need a addendum to like fully get it or understand it or enjoy it. I've been like wrestling with if that it can be like a good record in and of itself.
Yeah, it's an eternal problem, I think, but that's something, one of the most interesting things that I think this album poses. Another thing, you guys kind of alluded to this a couple minutes ago, but it is very dense. It's a very dense record, and there's a lot of, I guess, sampling of strings or maybe like recreations of string type sounds. There's something very cinematic about the sound of this album, and it did make me think of RZA, who you mentioned earlier, Dan. I thought a lot about Raekwon's Only Built for Cuban Links in particular, because what that record does is it takes like your normal kind of street like gang shit, and it makes it feel really cinematic and just larger than life. Like all of a sudden, this, you just think about like a young Raekwon like selling drugs or something like that, and that little story is elevated to like the level of The Godfather or something, and it's like these very real drama in just like normal people's lives or something. And to me, I felt like this record was kind of working on the same level, especially with those strings and that just like dense, grandiosity of the music. It's like it makes, the loneliness you feel when you're walking home alone feel like very grand, like a grand tragedy or something like that. Did you guys get any of that from that kind of aspect of the music?
Yeah, and I mean, I get that, and I agree. Like it does do a good job of like this world building thing, and we've talked about that in the past, and I do enjoy that about records. I feel like maybe one reason I didn't like absolutely like fall in love with this record, and maybe why I've like always struggled, is like maybe these like experiences I haven't had. I didn't really like go to the club when I was younger, and until I was a bit older and stuff, and like. I don't know. Maybe I've never walked home alone in the rain. Like maybe that's why I don't like connect with it super well. But then again, I love Only Built for Cuban Links, and I've never sold drugs either.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think that this album kind of isolates you into that sort of emotion. I think that's just one. It's a good image for sure, but like to me. And I go back to more of the samples, like those YouTube samples and stuff like that. Like I just get this like real like human, experience out of this record where like nothing, like everything in the record, from the strings that you mentioned, Gabe, to like a random YouTube clip, like feels so intentional that it's connecting in a way that, a lot of records just don't do that. You know what I mean? Like it's exploring emotions and thoughts that like people have in their heads maybe, but how in the world do you articulate that in the form of music? And this is an interesting take on that,
Yeah, I think there's just something like so evocative about it. Like it just like evokes such a clear image to me of like, this kind of feeling of loneliness or something, and these specific experiences that I'm alluding to. But there is something that's kind of like, well, I guess we should dive into, you were sort of mentioning it, but like, so YouTube clips, being sampled, right? So there's this, basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's like this kind of strange stitched together fabric that makes this feel like a very consistent, like very deliberate and specific world, or like a deliberate and specific image that I keep talking about, where it's weirdly made up of like very cinematic, cavernous like string synth pads, these skeletal skittering beats, strange little clips of dialogue from like films and YouTube videos and things that are like you can barely understand them. There's a song, God, which one is it? It's Etched Headplate, that it samples like it's a popular R&B like pop song, but it's some random girl just sang it into her webcam.
I wanted to talk about that. Like that is like has to be like such a deliberate pick. Like why would you ever pick like this random girl singing it into her webcam over the original song, especially because like the vocals are pitched, so it's not even like, oh well, you know, her voice worked better, you know. It's like
right
like, why would you do that?
I feel like the image being evoked here, especially when we're talking about like the subject of loneliness, I mean, where do people go when they're like by themselves with a computer and the internet? They go deep diving into YouTube and all this sort of stuff, seeing just millions of different clips, you know what I mean? Like, and I feel like this is exactly what he's trying to kind of articulate by choosing to use a random clip over like the original song, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it kind of it's so like manipulated, the sound of that vocal sample, but you can hear like the digital artifacts and like the low quality of this YouTube video just saying into a, you know, webcam or whatever, and it really adds to, I think, that kind of lonely like image that this album just puts in my mind, which is like somebody kind of surfing, like web surfing. You know, I was thinking about like the difference between this album and something like Introducing or the really sample heavy music of the 90s, and that was all about like the fun of crate digging or something. There's nothing like fun or social or exciting about YouTube digging, you know. You're like alone, you know. I just imagine like the only light is the light from your computer screen, and you're like just digging through like shitty clips, you know,
like not reacting, you're just consuming it, you know what I mean? Just
whatever. It's not like when the Avalanches find some like really cool like Brazilian funk record that would make a great, you know, like bridge on the song they're working on. It's like, I don't know. It just feels like a much lonelier enterprise.
That is a good point. I didn't think about that. Like, crate digging is sort of a social like thing. Like, even if you're doing it by yourself, usually, you know, you find that great Brazilian funk thing, you share it with your friends or, you know, whatever. Like, but the you know, webcam singing YouTube video normally is a completely solitary experience. So, I think that's a good thing. I didn't even think of.
Yeah, another cool thing that I want to talk about is the sampling. There's like video game sampling. Specifically, there's a lot of sampling of Metal Gear Solid 2 for some reason, which must be a game he really likes, which I actually really like as well. You know, again, in this like, I'm just amazed that these strange, disparate things end up feeling like stitched together into this very clear world, this very clear like idea that he's trying to capture here. How do you guys see these Metal Gear Solid samples fitting into that?
Yeah, I mean, I love Metal Gear Solid as well, though I didn't really recognize any samples, certainly. You know, maybe if there was like that sound like whenever you get caught.
Right. They're not that over the top, yeah.
But, you know...
It's like a gun, you know, a shell from your gun, like hitting the ground.
The strings from the cinematic
strings
at the beginning.
From the intro. Yeah.
You know, I think that what that is evoking in my mind, again, is like Metal Gear Solid, that series, is a very singular experience. This is not your Call of Duty, your social, you know, online type of game. Like, this is a game that you're playing, again, by yourself. The light probably only coming from your television now as you're playing this and having this experience by yourself. So it fits right in with all of us.
It does. That's a good point, because also not only is it a game like you play by yourself, but it's a game that like you can't just play for 5-10 minutes. You know, like if you're playing Metal Gear, like you got hour-long cutscene. You know, you're in it for hours and stuff.
And then it explores some pretty deep, you know, subjects regarding like human nature and all that sort of stuff. So again, it fits in.
It's something like very. You know, I want to like eventually turn to sort of this cultural context, but there's something very modern about this because, you know, if you think about it, it was not that long ago that video games became immersive in this way. You know, before the early 2000s, there was like really no such thing, and then games like, you know, Metal Gear Solid started to come out, and they're such like deep and moving experiences, really, that like get into really, huge issues. And I just think about like the way I felt playing Metal Gear Solid 2, which is like I was, a completely like lonely kid, basically. I mean, I wasn't like, depressed or anything. I just didn't have a fucking car, so I couldn't go anywhere and hang out with anybody. But, you're pretty lonely. You stay up all night. You're playing this game, and you're having like very intense experiences via this game.
Right.
It's like, it's really profound. And
can we talk about the ending? Can we spoil Metal Gear Solid 2?
Yeah, I think it's been, what? Almost 20 years, so go ahead.
Well, like when the Colonel starts like bugging out and like everything that you thought you understood is like, going crazy, and you find out that the Patriots and all this shit's like going on and everything's wrong. It's like commentary on what you think is going on in the world, but you don't know, right? Like all the stuff hiding in the shadows that's like controlling the entire world, kind of all being put on display in this video game. You know what I mean? Kind of exactly what you're probably thinking, right?
Right. And there's something kind of sad about the experience of like, like feeling those things via a video game alone in your room. I just feel like this record is almost, that's how I see it fitting into the YouTube clips and like the club sounds and stuff. And again, everything just soaked in reverb and kind of distant and ghostly. And, it all hangs together. Dan, you kind of said that, at least for the drums, you said that there was something a little repetitive about this, but do you feel at all like just these elements are kind of like hanging together in a really unique and cohesive way?
Oh yeah, it's super cohesive. It builds this world and everything, which I like. I like it. It gets a little repetitive for me. And one of the things I love about like electronic music, and I've said it many times on here, Autechre is my favorite electronic group, one of my favorite groups in general. And like the thing I like about electronic music is like I like hearing sounds. I like just exploring like all these different noises you've never heard and stuff. And like here, it's almost too human. If that makes like any sense, like the drums seem like it seems like a drum set. Like if you play just a regular drum set, it sounds the same every time you play it because it's the same drums. Whereas like this Aphex Twin song has a completely different drum set than this one or Autechre, whoever. And so like it just gets a little samey. And then the same thing with the vocals. Like I kind of felt like the trick of like pitch shifting them, whether it be up or down, it just starts to wear thin after, you hear it track after track after track. And again, electronic music, I kind of prefer when there's not vocals. So that was a little, it took a little getting used to for me. But I don't want people to get, I don't want any hate mail. Like, I'm not saying I don't like this record or that I hate it or anything. I guess I'm just saying I don't think it's as good as everybody else thinks.
Wow. Well, I get that. I totally get that. And it's actually interesting to think about because we talked about like Autechre quite a bit on that Warp Records episode we did a little while ago. It's interesting to think of how different this is from Autechre. And I agree that Autechre is more about like creating sounds you've never heard. I will say that they're reused here, but just those components are things I've never heard here. Like the way that the drums are created and are like slipping in and out of time.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
The whoosh of like I think specifically of a track like Ghost Hardware, like that like whooshing sound. It's just like feels like the speakers are completely exploded or something. The way that the like vinyl crackle and stuff is layered so perfectly into all of this, the digital artifacts that remain on the samples and stuff. And anyway, so to contrast it with Autechre, I think it's amazing the humanness of it, like you were saying, Dan, but the like emotion that he's able to pull out of such sounds. I feel, it's a different experience, but I feel no emotion really listening to Autechre. You know what I mean, Darren?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not a huge Autechre fan like you guys either, but I mean, I was like totally just listening to like the instruments and like what the music was doing. You know what I mean? Like not thinking about what or why, any of this is happening. With with Burial now, like I'm like every track, even though, Dan, I don't disagree that things are kind of samey. I mean, the approach is the same, right? There's vocals on every track. Every track, though, I'm thinking, all right, what's he getting at? What am I missing here? What is this one about? Like, I want to go deeper. I want to understand more. That doesn't really happen with like Autechre, and that's not, that's not a bad thing. It's just a totally different take on it.
Yeah, and there is something. Yeah, I don't know. There's just something interesting about, like, I think searching through these sounds and trying to be like, that sounded like a car door opening or something. Like Autechre is like, we joked about this, but it's like they're not sounds that you can really relate to real life at all. We were talking about like,
you're like, they're not earthly sounds.
That sounded like maybe a paper bag exploding like underwater or something. Like they're so distant, but this is so tangible and so real. And I think it creates a very interesting, like very visceral experience of like, that sounds like keys. That sounds like, a car door. That sounds like, something very interesting about that. Now, another thing I wanted to mention, I want to kind of like shift a little bit into the context, why this resonated so much. Another thing that occurred to me is, and tell me if I'm crazy, but this must have been the first time when you really could like walk around town listening to music on your headphones, like didn't the iPod kind of make that possible? I can't even remember, but like with CD players, you couldn't go like walking around and be skipping like crazy.
You gotta have anti-skip. You didn't have the anti-skip one, and then before
you
that,
throw it in your pocket. What are you talking about? You can.
I used to cut the grass with mine. Yeah, all the time.
Me too, and I had to stop every 5 seconds and fix it because
you had some Bobo ass CD player.
Look, what I did is I recorded my CDs onto a cassette tape. And
that's big brain shit right there.
That's crazy. But you can see what I'm saying, right? That like I think this album sort of coincides with the iPod era.
Yeah, no,
and
I agree.
That created a whole new version of loneliness, which is like, if you're gonna like take the bus, like there's something sort of social about that until the iPod is invented. Then you can have your headphones in, as I do, 24/7, and I go about town running errands and stuff without really like even interacting with a soul. It's actually possible now to feel lonely in a crowded place in a way that I think it wasn't before. Are you guys on board with that at all?
No, I do agree with you because with the CD player, like one, you had to switch out the CD. You kind of just didn't have an endless thing. You could, especially if you like at school. I had a little, I bring my little CD book, But even then, how many do you bring a day? 4 or 5. Whereas like the iPod now, you have like essentially your entire music library, in your pocket, and like the CD player. Especially if you're using the anti-skip, it kills your batteries. Those batteries were expensive. Whereas the iPod, you just charge it. So yeah, I get you. And I mean, I'm the same way as you. I basically, if I'm going to the store by myself or anything, I've always got headphones in. I would rather not talk to anybody if I can help it. And so yeah, I agree. I mean, the iPod definitely made it easier. I don't think it invented it, but I think it did exacerbate it.
It was definitely a game changer.
Yeah.
And I would add that, earbuds became a lot more popular too, because I mean, back in the day, we were kind of using those like over the head or over the ear headphones that were very like obvious. Like, yes, you have headphones on and they're not very noise isolating at all. And that technology really became much more mainstream, I think, post, the iPod. Now people wear earbuds.
Yeah, that's true.
You can't even see them.
So you always had those
noise
like
isolating.
Because you don't even mean like the big, like what people say it can't, like what I'm wearing right now. You mean like those little, they just like sort of sat on top of your ear with that weird like styrofoam shit. Yeah, those fucking suck.
Yes, tons of like bleeding sound out so like everyone can hear.
Yeah, they were awful.
Well, I kind of thought about because there are a lot of like samples, like I said, of that seem to come from films, and they seem to come from interviews, YouTube clips and stuff of just like little chatter or talking, and it's like you can't really even understand what's being said. I think probably hardcore fans have like really figured it out or whatever, but it's like, to me it just sort of evoked that experience of having my earbuds in and overhearing stuff or whatever, that occasional bleed in, was kind of how I made sense of that. I mean, what did you guys, how did you guys think about those little indistinguishable speeches, that are happening throughout.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't connect it to the earphone bleed-in thing, but it does make sense, now that you say it. I did sort of just think of it as like walking through the city, and it's a conversation that's a little far from you or something, and you can't quite, you can hear it, but maybe you can't make out all the words or exactly what they're talking about or something. But yeah, I didn't really think of it as like the earphone thing, but I kind of like that better.
Just kind of adds to the loneliness, right, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could look at it that way. I mean, honestly, I've certainly had my share of times walking through a city or walking around without earbuds on, but just listening and hearing random conversations as you walk by. Obviously you don't interact with any of that, but like you could hear little snippets of that, and that's kind of what I feel like you're hearing here as well, like indistinct conversations as you're passing by. Maybe you're sitting there drinking coffee and you can just hear in the general noise of the world, different things popping in and out. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, I meant to mention this, but there's almost no song that sums this album up better than "In McDonald's," which to me is basically like what the cover art seems to be. It's just like a guy in his hoodie, looks pretty sad, sitting in front of like a coffee or something. It's like you stop at the McDonald's to maybe sober up a little bit or something on your way home from the club, and it's just a very depressing scene. I mean, I just almost feel like this track "In McDonald's," like just the image that it paints, because it's quite like cavernous, and it almost starts to sound like a church choir or something. I mean, I love how sometimes these disembodied kind of androgynous vocals are overlapping in ways that create like this chorus, like this angelic kind of chorus sound. And again, it adds to the grandiosity of just sitting in a McDonald's sad and alone, which I think is really interesting. On that note, let's switch, like I said, into that cultural context. This is where we get over intellectual with this album, but maybe it'll be fun anyway. Pitchfork wrote this article for the 10-year anniversary. It's called "Why Burial's Untrue is the Most Important Electronic Album of the Century So Far." And it talked about a lot of really interesting things, but a couple things that really struck me were, connecting this album and the whole Burial project, which really starts in like 05, 06, with these London terrorist attacks, these like bus bombings, and I think the subway was also bombed in 05. And it all kind of ties into this sort of post 9/11 like terrorism era, right? And the idea that this album is like, on one hand, there's a personal loneliness, like we've been talking about just like walking home from the club or whatever. But there's also something like super profound about the idea of like what a terrorist attack can do to a city, like what the whole world was going through at this time. Like just think about like how vibrant and exciting London is, but then think about it in the weeks and months after a terrorist attack like that. How New York must have been after 9/11. It's weird, actually, we're recording this episode on 9/11, the 18th anniversary, by total chance. But the album almost has that quality of like those ghostly memories and stuff of these like club tracks that seem like they're happening in the past. It almost seems to evoke like, this like loss of innocence or something, or this loss of these fun times, like you're like, I don't know, walking around a city and that fun spirit you remember about it is gone, never to come back. Like, did that kind of resonate with you guys at all?
I feel like that's over intellectualizing it a little bit. Like I don't think I would ever listen to this record and be like, this reminds me of the time after 9/11. Like I just
it really does for me. I
mean, like once someone says it, I'm like, when you say like, think of how the city is now quiet and stuff. It's like, okay, yeah. I mean, it makes sense, but I feel like was Burial thinking that? Was he like, I'm gonna. And maybe he was, especially since like you said, those London bombings were in 05. This record came out in 06, or I mean 07 rather. But I'm sure he's working on it in the aftermath. So maybe you're right, but I don't know. I feel like that's sort of like a bit of a stretch that maybe the critics or writers or something are shoehorning in. I mean, and maybe there's interviews or something where he mentions that, and that I don't know. I'm not a huge fan or anything, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I feel like that's a bit of a stretch over intellectualizing a little bit.
What do you think, Darren?
I mean, I think I'm kind of drinking the Kool-Aid at this point, where like pretty much any level of thought on this record, I'm like gonna buy right into. So in regards to this, like the way I kind of look at it is, he's sort of like bringing together, like colliding this really strange emotion that you get from as an outsider to when you look at like the world after 9/11, the world after a London bombing like that, and how significant of an impact that has just on the culture. But then at the same time, there's this other side of culture where everything's just happy, and you go into the club and having fun, and you got all these like mindless songs that are about whatever, and he's like bridging those things together. Like this is like all happening at once. Again, like it's a human experience. It's really hard for me to like try to articulate this, but
I think I get what you're saying. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but it's almost like if you went to a club and you heard this Ray J song, like, 2 weeks after these bombings, you might be like, what is even the fucking point of this? And it's almost like the album, it sounds like fun that isn't happening right now or something. Like fun is happening far away from you and you can't reach it.
I get that more, and I do like agree with the fun that's sort of happening. Like, I mean, I've been in situations where like everyone's having fun and I'm depressed or something, and it's like, you sort of, I mean, you can even get a little angry about it, like, these stupid people like having fun at a time like this or something. But also, like, it could just, and maybe the record's like feeling like that because of these bombings, but it also may be just like he's having girl troubles, and like I feel like that maybe makes more sense, like.
Well, it's like it's all happening, and it's all a part of the experience. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, he is dealing with loneliness, girl troubles, like you mentioned, but like
I just feel like
it is still banging. The London bombing still happened. Like it's all.
I get that. It's just like I don't know, like trying to put like this one event in it. Again, unless he's specifically said it, or there's something that I'm missing that really connects.
I don't know if that's necessary, because he said something like, Archangel. He might have been being a little facetious, but that he made Archangel after his dog died or something like that, and which I don't want to trivialize. That can be quite sad, but I think that whether he intended to or not, it does seem to sort of evoke this era, and people talk a lot about this. Might have to be its own episode, but like every major event informs like the art of that period,
I mean, of course,
in some way. And so if you want to talk about like what is post 9/11 music, I've always had a hard time thinking about like how to talk about that, because it's not immediately obvious what effect that had, but it has to have had,
I mean, of course,
some effect. And this feels like a very post 9/11 album. I don't know why.
I mean, I can see it, but what I'm thinking is something like Basinski's Disintegration tapes. That's very tied to 9/11, and it is for a reason, because Basinski like has this whole story of him like doing.
Okay, but it's also
like
interesting.
people. I don't think people would think of Disintegration tapes as being about 9/11 unless Basinski said this. Hey, this is sort of
maybe
connected to 9/11.
It might be easily connected because and it's actually kind of similar to this album in a weird way, in the sense that like there is something in that Basinski album. You're basically listening to like melodies, but the important part is not the melody. The important part is like the disintegration, like the thing that's separating you from the melody. There's like this wall, and in Burial, you're basically like listening to chopped and screwed, Ashanti songs, but what's really important about it is like the wall between you and the club music that's being played.
I guess what I agree that the wall exists. Like I 100% agree with that. I just don't know that I can make that leap that the wall is because of like a certain historical event. I think the wall could easily be his dog dying, a girl trouble, just depression in general.
Okay.
I just feel like it's a bit of a jump to say it's definitely about this when the artist hasn't said it.
Well, surely. I just think that like it kind of fits in that era very well, whether he intended it to or not. And that article also talks a little bit about like the sort of vibrant UK rave culture of the maybe 80s and 90s. I know like the 80s underground in New York City was also, with like, what was that guy's name? Arthur Russell and everything, was such a big scene. And so the article talks about like it's as if Burial's sort of like walking around London, looking at these empty warehouses where there once were such vibrant and alive parties, and like feeling its absence. Like people talk about like you go into a room or something and you can kind of feel the history that happened there or something. Darren, do you kind of feel that in the music a little bit? I mean, I think we're drinking the Kool-Aid together. So you with me on this as well?
Somewhat, but I think I like it less of him just like, going out and looking at these abandoned areas and deciding to write music about it. You know what I mean? And more like, I think I like the singular experience of it all, like the personal experience of it, and not just feeling like, I don't know, the way you described that just sort of felt a lot less like of a personal, like human experience with that. You know what I mean? I kind of get where you're coming from, but I don't know. That one I'm not so keen on.
Okay, well, and I wanted to mention, Dan, you'll get on board if I bring this up, but that the Caretaker, that album that came out, that huge album that came out this year, or that he finished this year, that's kind of a similar idea. I think there's, they call it like this hauntology music, or like turntablism it's sometimes called, but like, that basically in that case you're listening to like sort of, whatever disposable shitty music from the 30s, but the idea is like it's dealing with memory and loss of memory and loss in a larger sense. I feel like this Burial album is firing on the same cylinders. It's like
that. I think that works towards my point a little bit, though, because that Caretaker record, he himself has said this is about somebody suffering from Alzheimer's and like that disintegration of memory. Again, he said that. Maybe like I think
you gotta let that go.
I think you could listen to
a famous incident where Ray Bradbury tried to say that his book Fahrenheit 451 isn't about censorship.
Yeah,
and he gave this talk in front of a college, and the college students were like, "You're wrong, dude," and he was fucking wrong. So I don't think author intent is the beginning and end of every conversation.
I wouldn't say it's the beginning and end, but I think it's important. And I mean, I think with that Caretaker record, like, yeah, I think you could get those feelings of like disintegration and memory and stuff without him saying that. And I mean, we get those feelings. Like I said, I agree that this wall exists. I just don't know why the wall is there, because I'm not the person who made it, and I haven't heard that person say why. Like,
right.
Like, I feel like we're maybe being a little nitpicky with each other. Like, we're generally agreeing on the same point. Like, I agree that there is this wall, but just, maybe we're disagreeing on why or how it was built.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I was going to say is I just think, as an artist, you sort of have to realize that, like, yes, you have your interpretation of something that you've put out there, but especially with an album that becomes as, I don't want to say necessarily popular, but like a cult hit, obviously.
Yeah.
You certainly wouldn't want to come out and say anything at this point, because kind of like Gabe's point about Ray Bradbury, like, it's no longer really yours, right? I mean, it's beyond your reach. So anything you say on it's not gonna change anything.
And even like beyond that, I'm really just trying to figure out like why this resonated so much at the time. And I think the like international mood, had maybe something to do that. Another thing, we sort of talked about this, but the idea of this new online era, I think, was really important to this album. We talked about like scouring the internet, how it's a very different thing than crate digging, but also we haven't talked about how, at this time, Burial was anonymous. He was unknown completely. And I guess when this album became such a big hit, like these, annoying British tabloids that are always ruining everything and killing Princess Diana and whatnot, they just went so hard to figure out who he was that he just basically posted like a single picture online and was like, "This is my name, so now we can drop it," But do you guys think like that there's something about like being anonymous that is so integral to like the early online experience, that was such a like, foundation shaking, aspect of living life, like so many people living their entire lives anonymously online? And do you guys see Burial's anonymity factoring into why this kind of resonated with those kind of people?
Yeah, I mean the early 2000s were sort of a wild west of internet, and and anonymity was like the thing. That was why 4chan was so popular and stuff, and before it turned into some alt-right bullshit. It was like fun. You could
Right.
go on there and like everything you did was deleted at sometimes within minutes or hours at basically the most, and just everybody was like operating in this weird like strange thing that the essentially like had never existed like in humanity. Like when was there ever a time like that you could say something that people would actually hear or see, and they wouldn't even have anything to connect it to with, they wouldn't see your face, wouldn't know your name, wouldn't hear your voice, anything. It's just something that only existed for that short window of time. And I think like him having anonymity, it added to that. And, something like this, like the mystery around it, like always sort of helps. Electronic music, I think like of a genre, there's probably more people who are anonymous in electronic music than anything else. And it probably has to do with it being a computer-based sort of thing. But like,
yeah.
I think it was like important.
It just kind of adds to that, like the thematic stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah,
like this kind
exactly.
Of loneliness and this alien. Yeah, you in on that, Darren?
Oh, absolutely. Like I was totally going to mention exactly what like Dan was talking about regarding 4chan, but also like the on the other side of the spectrum, we have like Facebook blowing up at this point. You know what I mean? Like
it's definitely like the end of that period.
Yeah, it's like putting yourself out there in such a public way, and then this retraction where you have the opportunity to go on places like 4chan and these other message boards where like suddenly you can be completely hidden, and then this entire new culture. I remember the early days of 4chan, like feeling like, wow, this is like the inside of people's brains that you just never knew
exactly
was really being thought about, and it's being put out there. And again, this album just seems to fit sort of so perfectly in that idea of like being inside of somebody's head and like just having the full experience of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I do want to talk about this because I think that it's a very significant part of this album's legacy, honestly, this idea of 4chan and 4chan's music board, Mew, this album becoming really like part of the Mew core, the so-called Mew core albums. And this whole idea of feels albums, that got a little normie, this idea of feels. But I remember, back in the day when this album was just getting posted constantly, and it's like, in this thread, post albums that give you feels, and stuff like that. And this was like the one that was getting posted so much, among some others. But it might be like the definitive feels album. Paul even mentioned in his email, that this helped him through some hard times. And I feel like a lot of people who really connect with this album must feel the same exact way. I mean, isn't that feels like an interesting, like distinctly modern idea, like the feels album. It feels so like early internet, so post 9/11 to bring that up again. Like, you know what I mean? Having these personal connections.
I disagree with that a little bit. I mean, I don't think that's a new thing. I mean, the Smiths are like the quintessential band like that, and that was the 80s, either the Cure, the same way and all. But I mean, I get what you say. Like a way to like this period of like the internet and everything and Mew, it was like sort of the first time you had those records that you could like share with people, like normally, like if you were some lonely teenager in the 80s and you got into Queen is Dead, it would have been, especially if you didn't have friends and that was why you were lonely, it would be hard to like talk about that experience with anybody. Whereas like now we have this like thing connecting all these people, and you can be in your bedroom by yourself but still talking.
This Burial album,
exactly.
This Burial album is one of the things that brought these people together, that they bonded over. It's weird,
like bonding over your loneliness. Yeah, it is
your loneliness through Burial. And like I was listening to this podcast the other day that was talking about, somebody wrote a book about 4chan basically, which is interesting. Now after like all the alt-right stuff or whatever, people are interested in it. But actually, I always thought, I was like, God, one day people are going to write books about 4chan because it was such a creative place. I didn't realize they would be writing about it because it was such a terrible, horrible place. But oh well. Anyway, so they were kind of talking about like this 4chan generation and this idea of like these kind of disaffected young white men who like, you know, are just lonely, isolated, like feeling out of touch, disconnected, and kind of bonding in like a weird self-deprecating way online. And then of course, growing up to get Donald Trump elected and, you know, do school shootings and stuff like that. That's later on. But at this time, you know, I just think that is like what this album really resonates with. I think it's a huge part of its legacy, and I don't think it's a bad thing. You know what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, for sure. I think I keep on saying it, but I don't know how to articulate it that well, because I think the album does a really fascinating job of like getting it. You know what I mean? Like I feel like when you listen to it enough, you dig around a little bit, maybe do some reading and kind of get a better understanding of what is going on. It just becomes more rewarding of an experience because you're just continuing to unravel it. And I imagine that is why people call it like their feels record. I'm sure people love talking about how they go back to it and they feel like they find something new every time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And, you know, and I just want to clarify, you know, because I think that on Burial's like a Rival Dealer EP and probably other places, you know, he sort of, there's like a clip that's sort of like a trans activist speaking, and it seems like he's definitely not on board with the alt-right stuff. But what I'm trying to say is that there was a period when this album like came out that it was like a purer time in the world of 4chan and Mew when it was just like kind of lonely people had found this place where they found each other. You know, like they never knew that other people like them, as lonely as them, existed. I just feel like that's really kind of a fascinating point in history that this exists. What about the influence of this album? Paul's email, he sort of mentions like he sees this as influencing like stuff like James Blake, the XX, all the way into Billie Eilish. I think that that's pretty indisputable, but I almost see this album as predicting. We were talking about how I feel like it doesn't really fit into its era. I feel like it kind of predicts the entire 2010s. It's almost like the first album of like an entire decade of sad music. You know, it seems to, in my mind, predate stuff like all these like hyper-aware internet phenomena, like the hauntology stuff and the turntablism, hypnagogic pop, like Ariel Pink, where it's like kind of self-aware, like, you know, as if he's making a forgotten lost record or something, and it's like buried in fuzz and lo-fi and stuff. Vaporwave, you know, with like the sort of ironically listening to shitty music, pitch shifted and warped through some kind of wall or something. Other genres like Witch House, but even stuff like trap. I mean, this like low subterranean bass with just like tinkling hi-hats and stuff. Do you feel like this has a pretty immense influence? Because I became convinced that it does.
Yeah, I think so, especially like with the hypnagogic pop. I mean, I think like that is sort of like a indie rock like version of this sort of record. And Vaporwave too, a lot. Man, I wish I could remember exactly what song it was, but there's one song on this record where it's sort of like it's like he's like pushing buttons and you're getting like these weird like sort of artifacting kind of things happening. It like it's getting like a digital sort of like distortion on the sounds and everything, and like that it's a short little 20-30 seconds. I think it might be in Dog Shelter if I'm remembering right. And like that sounds like that little clip is like the most vaporwave thing, you know, outside of actual vaporwave. So I was thinking of that a lot when listening to that part. So I definitely can see this as you know, foreshadowing a lot of like what would come. And I agree with you. This is like sort of the first you know, shot in the world of sad music that would be to come.
Yeah, what do you think, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I disagree. You know, I know I sort of still feel like this album sounds like it's from the late 2000s, you know, pre-2010, but as far as like influencing and sort of being at the forefront of what was to come, like I can't really disagree with what you said, Gabe.
I feel like I was thinking like, how would I describe Future? The artist Future. Like just booming subterranean bass, like clattering hi-hat sounds, like a disembodied auto-tuned voice, like kind of moaning words and sounds that I can't understand. Fuck, it's the same exact way I would describe Burial. I mean, like,
that's a good point.
I'm kind of in awe at like, and I can't think of anything before this really that would like so directly connects. But once you get into like this kind of minimalism of stuff like James Blake and the XX and stuff, and then Trap is quite minimalist, and then the sadness, like you guys just said, it's like this has been a sad decade. And we talked about like Billie Eilish 2 weeks ago, or 2 episodes ago, and I can see it like stretching. I agree with Paul, it stretches all the way there. I was thinking about like, God, what was that term again? ASMR, like the
whatever
thing we were connecting to Billie Eilish. Yeah, so there's something like very intimate about this album, like sampling things like that sound like car keys jingling, or like a light footstep or something, or like tapping on a Pringles can or something. Like the idea of that making the beat feels like, it feels so predictive of this like ASMR idea of like just really quiet sounds, really hushed, whispery, intimate sounds in something so dense and booming.
Yeah, and I mean, such a thing wouldn't be possible without this kind of explosion of like the internet and this YouTube culture of, just being able to like have the world right there at your screen, but you're just by yourself, you know what I mean? And then at the very same time, like you guys were describing, you also have access to share this lonely experience with thousands and thousands of other people who are doing the exact same thing. So things just will never go back to it. There will never be the world will never know, or like I guess kids, right, will never know the feeling of like, beating like Metal Gear Solid and then looking over to your left and right and like no one's there, right? They won't know that, because whatever game that they are playing, they'll already know and be connected to hundreds and thousands of other people who are doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
That's true. It's
really fascinating.
And there are fewer and fewer solitary experiences somehow.
It's all like goddamn Fortnite.
I know. As a side note, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but how like I'm always sort of saying that like at the end of the decade, music seems to change. After this sad as fuck decade, do you think the next decade, the 2020s, is going to be like just really happy music, or can we never go back to happiness again?
I don't know. It's usually the pendulum swings, happy, sad, whatever. But I don't know. And I mean, it's like the world kind of sucks right now a little bit.
Well, I think the election in November is also going to have a impact on that.
Yeah, that could decide it. If it's good, then maybe that fixes it. But we'll see.
But I could totally imagine like music critics 30 years from now being like, the 2020s were all about, acknowledgement of the oblivion we were all facing with climate change and Donald Trump's 7th term in office, but reckless abandon with fun dance music that ironically celebrate, whatever. I can totally see it. All right, I wanted to spend a couple minutes just talking, briefly. We didn't sort of assign listening beyond Untrue, but Burial has had a really strange career trajectory. He's sort of avoided following up on Untrue by releasing actually quite a lot of EPs. And sometimes these EPs are as long as albums. They usually consist of like 2 or 3 songs that can be as long as like 15 minutes each. What do you make of that? Like, do you sense that he's like, it's like the burden of following this up is too much, or, what is that?
I think it could be that. And I mean, and if it is that, I think it's sort of a smart move. You wrote in our little thing, like sort of, in the airplane over the sea, we never got a follow up to that. And it's sort of like everybody kind of agrees. It's like Jeff Mangum, like couldn't deal with like this record becoming so huge and like couldn't follow it up. And I feel like that, that's kind of seems like what's maybe happened here. At least like Burial has released music, just in a sort of different format. And when you use the single EP format, if you release a dud here and there, people just always sort of seem to forgive that. Like if your favorite band releases like an EP that sucks a lot, you're never like, oh God, what's happened. You're always like, it's just an EP. Who cares? Yeah, as long as the album's good. And like, so it kind of gives you like an out because the same thing. If you release an EP and it kicks ass, everyone, like people, you can get the props, but you don't get the negatives. Or it's almost like it's like true. The mixtape thing in hip hop. Almost
low stakes.
Yeah, exactly. Low stakes, high reward with the EP and the single thing. So I think it's sort of a good move on his part. Maybe there's some other reason behind it, but I feel like it. I guess I'm going against myself when I was saying earlier. Not putting words in the artist's mouth. I'm going to put words in his mouth and say that that it does sort of seem like that.
What do you think, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like Dan said, I mean, the only thing I would really add is like when you do an EP, you sort of immediately remove the idea of like having to draw a comparison to your albums, right? I mean, sure, people can talk about it, but at the end of the day, they're gonna be like, well, that's just an EP. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a full statement. It's not 12, 13 tracks or whatever. Even though if you combined obviously all of these EPs together, you could easily piece together some sort of album long thing. But and I'm not going to say whether I feel like that's a smart move or not or whatever, but I mean, I certainly believe that with something like Untrue, similar to like in the Airplane over the sea, like it's kind of just impossible to follow up, right? And like no matter what you do, it'll never amount to what that original album had done. So why not just try to release music in a different method, different format altogether?
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice solution, and a lot of those, I would say most of those EPs have actually been seen as like excellent. Some of them are considered masterpieces. Some of them people, the edgy like Dan types, they say that they're even better than Untrue. But I've listened to all of them, and I think they're pretty much uniformly fantastic. And you're right, Darren, it's like basically hours of material. It's as if he's released follow-ups, and yet he sort of hasn't had to follow this up. I think that sort of contributes to the legacy of Untrue in a way similar to In the Airplane Over the Sea. And it's funny too, because, even though he's released like hours of material like every year, every 2 years, that the next time he announces a full-length album, it's going to be huge news.
Even though he's consistently released stuff. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, totally bizarre, but it might turn out to be kind of smart. It's kind of interesting, actually. Okay, so I think we can start to wrap up here, and just sort of give our final thoughts. I think that this is the kind of album that I feel like we could really talk about for hours, because it seems to introduce so many interesting questions. Another one that I think is pretty fascinating is that, because I had never really spent a lot of time with this record, I always thought of it as like this masterpiece with this huge legacy and everything. And I imagined it would be like the most meticulously crafted, electronic album. And in a way it is. Like thematically, it really feels like a very tight, cohesive thing. And yet I was kind of delighted by the amateurism of it. We talked about how the beats like aren't perfectly in time, and it seems to be a little loose. I think that it's interesting how because nothing feels just looped or like sequenced, perfectly. It feels like tracks can kind of like grow and evolve, like speed up, slow down a little bit, grow in intensity. It makes me think of, something like post-rock or something, where it's like, you can kind of repeat the same thing over and over again, but sort of build the intensity of it and create quite a dramatic close. It adds kind of a live feel. People, I don't want to get into the whole debate, but, whether this is dubstep or not or whatever, but, the idea of dub, the original dub, with like King Tubby and Lee Perry and stuff, is live mixing of music. And there feels like a live human feel to this, and like sort of a delightful amateurism. In fact, I learned that he recorded this whole thing in 2 weeks, like just in a burst of creativity.
Insane.
Yeah. Isn't that, so I think that could be like its own whole episode, like masterpieces that were recorded like totally on the fly. I think that kind of adds to the charm of this record, don't you?
Yeah, I mean that's super impressive, and like I said earlier, I mean my favorite part about the record is like that the swing to it and the kind of amateurishness. I mean a lot of times like with electronic music, it gets a little stuffy, and the other thing, like you sort of mentioned, things here don't seem like just looped. Like a lot of electronic music, it sort of seems like they wrote a 8 bars of a song and then they looped it for 6 minutes or whatever, and like it never really feels like that here. It sort of always feels like even just slightly it's evolving or moving or changing. Like it never, like each bar never seems like the same exact bar that preceded it, which is interesting and something you don't get very often in this genre.
And it's necessary because a lot of these songs are really quite like simple in an amateurish way, where it's like just the same 4 chords over and over again and the same vocal loop over and over again. But the fact that it feels like it's kind of, human and changing in subtle ways really saves it. You kind of know what I mean, Darren?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I initially sort of described the sound as like atmospheric, when you describe something as like atmospheric, it's usually difficult to define it, right? Like because there's no clear definition because it's just sort of filling the space and it's, all around you. We've talked about this idea of like sort of drifting and stuff. And it's really interesting that like, you can describe that not just with the music, but like sort of the technique of how the music was recorded, especially like an electronic album. I mean, generally the electronic albums that I've listened to are like so perfectly in sync, so perfectly timed that like you don't even like, we harp on like indie rock that sounds too perfect, but we don't do that with like electronic music because it's just supposed to be. True. I mean, it's structured, to be perfectly in sync, right? So to sort of like change that approach with this amateurish quality, but also like, I don't know, I don't want to necessarily just say like raw, but just like a, by not trying to make it so perfect, and creating this like atmosphere, this drifting sort of, as if like you're inside the head of somebody and you're just drifting past all sorts of thoughts and stuff. Like that's incredible to think that you could have all of that come through in 2 weeks. I mean, I could understand recording an EP or something in 2 weeks, but my God, like this entire album, like, and here we are talking about it, and I can only imagine the level of discussions that people have had about this album that only took 2 weeks for a human being to make. Incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, that kind of gets right into my final thoughts on this thing is that, I found myself pretty much in awe at it. And I understand why people see it as so important and so influential because it feels, like a just such an accomplishment. It feels so like it really resonates with its era and sort of continues to resonate even, 12 years later. I still feel it's like tentacles all throughout popular music. And it raises like a bunch of questions that I think are just so fascinating. And of course, we have an entire podcast dedicated to like over intellectualizing music. And this album really lends itself well to it. So, thank you, Paul, for requesting it. And I would invite the rest of our listeners to send us ideas, but see if you can top this. See if you can give me something that's really going to blow my fucking mind like this one did. What about you guys? Did you enjoy the experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that I finally like took the time to really like dig into this record. I mean, like I said, I didn't have like this great overwhelming experience with it. It didn't become like a record that I'm gonna return to all the time or anything. But I am glad I did it. I really enjoyed intellectualizing about it. I feel like maybe even it just maybe it missed me. Like maybe if I had heard this when I was younger or in a like headspace that sort of like fits the record more, that I maybe would have enjoyed it more than I did currently. But it's an album that's worth hearing. I'm glad I finally like dug deep into it. But I guess I'm the one of the three of us that was less into it.
Which is a big surprise, isn't it? And I'll go on the record, and I told you guys off the air that I was kind of alluding to the fact that I wasn't really enjoying this.
Yeah.
And I didn't really. I mean, I listened to it a lot. I was just listening to it without any context, without any digging around or anything like that, and just could not, it just didn't really stick with me, right? But after doing some of the reading that you shared, Gabe, that video that I looked at that sort of explained a lot of these samples and the process,
Resident Advisor
I immediately came back to the record and was like, wait a second, this is what I've been missing this entire time. I'm not here to say just yet that it's a 10 for me necessarily, but it's certainly a record that I want to continue to peel the layers on. This sort of is immediately bringing to mind my feelings about Kid A, you know what I mean?
Wow.
An album that has so much depth to it that I've connected to for such a long time. I feel like this album could very much be in that same sort of conversation when it comes to just being in that sort of mindset. And you mentioned this, Dan, about being in that right headspace, and I totally agree. It's hard for me to want to listen to this record a lot. You know what I mean? I don't think I can't think of a lot of opportunities. I'm obviously with kids and everything like that. I'm not just sitting alone at a computer, lonely about my own life. It's just not where I'm at right now. But there are certainly opportunities and times where I can imagine just putting this record on because I enjoy it. I enjoy the introspection, right? And I enjoy thinking about the different aspects of the human experience that these songs are sort of evoking, right? Maybe it's my life, maybe it's just thinking about things in general. I love to do that. I mean, I think a lot of people love to just sort of sit in their thoughts and stuff like that. And this album seems perfect to just kind of let you do that. You know what I mean? So if for anybody who's listening, who's never experienced Burial, I would highly recommend do a little bit of research, just kind of find out a little bit more about these samples and stuff, and then give the album, a really fair shot, because I just don't think very many people would be disappointed.
Yeah, and let me just add that, you just made me realize sort of that, if you're feeling maybe it's too late because you also have kids or something, and, you're not lonely in front of your computer anymore, I think that you can still get a lot in it, because I'm not a depressed sophomore in college anymore, but this album almost makes me nostalgic for when I was a depressed kid in college,
yeah.
Coming home from the club and being kind of sad and a little drunk. Good times, honestly.
If only we could go back. Those back when Four Loko was great.
Oh, the days.
Oh, God. Yeah, those are the days. All right, well, what do you think? We'd love to read your thoughts on the air. We'd love to get ideas from you, like we said. So email us, popshieldpod@gmail.com. Next episode in 2 weeks. Not sure what we're doing yet. Give us an idea. If you like the show, help us out by subscribing. Leave us a 5-star rate and review wherever you get your podcast. And fuck whoever wrote that bad one. And stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pop Shield Pod on all that. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you.
So long.